Oh, hello there, and thanks for joining Uncomplicated Math today. Today we're going to be looking at how to compare fractions that have different denominators. And by the end of this video, you'll know the steps involved in comparing fractions with different denominators. So let's get started. Whenever we're comparing fractions, the first step is to check for a common denominator. Because if the fractions have a common denominator, then we can just compare them as is. But if not, as we can see on the right-hand side here, our first step is going to be to find a common denominator because we can't compare fractions that have different denominators. And if you're unsure of how to find a common denominator, then I encourage you to pause this video and take a look at some of the video links in the description below where we go over the topic of finding a common denominator in a lot more detail. So in question number 1, we're being asked to compare 4/6 and 3/4. And we know that our first step is going to be to find a common denominator because we have two different denominators here. And we know that a common multiple for both 6 and 4 is 12. So we're going to have a new denominator of 12. Now we're going to move on to step number 2, where we're going to rewrite the fractions with our new common denominator. And we needed to multiply 6 times 2 in order to get the denominator of 12. So to keep this fraction equivalent, we need to do the same thing to our numerator up top. And when we multiply 4 times 2, we get 8. So now we need to do the same thing for our second fraction. We needed to multiply 4 times 3 in order to get the denominator of 12. So we need to do the same thing for our numerator up top. And when we multiply 3 times 3, we get 9. So now we can move on to step number 3, which is to actually compare, because as we can see, now that we have the same denominator, we just need to figure out which one has the greater value, or which one has the larger numerator. So now when we're comparing these fractions, we're going to use the greater than and less than symbols. And if you have a tough time remembering which is which, just imagine that the greater than or less than symbols has an alligator mouth and the numbers are fish. The alligator always eats the larger fish. So we can see here that our fraction 9/12 is greater than 8/12. So the alligator always eats the larger fish. So we have 3/4 as being greater than 4/6. So now let's move on to question number 2, where we're comparing 2/5 to 3/15. So we can see that we don't have a common denominator, so our first step is to find a common denominator. And 15 in this case just happens to be a multiple of 5, so we're going to rewrite these fractions with the common denominator of 15. And we had to multiply 5 times 3 in order to get 15, so we're going to do the same thing to our numerator up top. And 2 times 3 gives us 6. And now we didn't have to do any changing to our second fraction here, so we can just leave the numerator as is. So now that we've finished step number 2, we can go ahead and compare them. And we can see that 6/15 is greater than 3/15. So the alligator always eats the larger fish, and 2/5 is greater than 3/15 for question number 2. So now let's move on to question number 3, where we're comparing 6/8 to 11/16. And our first step is to find a common denominator, and 16 is a multiple of 8, so we're going to use the common denominator of 16 for rewriting these fractions. And we had to multiply 8 times 2 in order to get our new denominator, so we have to do the same thing for our numerator up top. And 6 times 2 gives us 12. And we didn't have to change the second fraction, so our numerator stays 11. And moving on to our last step, when we compare these two fractions, we can see that 12/16 is greater than 11/16. So the alligator always eats the larger fish, so 6/8 is greater than 11/16. So now let's move on to our last question, where we're being asked to compare 1/3 to 2/9. So our first step is to find a common denominator, and 9 is a multiple of 3, so we're going to use the common denominator of 9 for comparing these fractions. And we had to multiply 3 times 3 in order to get 9, so we need to do the same thing up top. And 1 times 3 gives us 3. And now, since we didn't have to rewrite our second fraction here because it already had the common denominator of 9, we can just write 2 down below because the numerator's value hasn't changed. And lastly, we're going to compare these fractions, and we can see that 3/9 is greater than 2/9. So we're going to make sure that the alligator always eats the larger fish, and 1/3 is greater than 2/9. So hopefully by now you understand the steps involved in comparing fractions with different denominators. Help make math less complicated by smashing those like and subscribe buttons. As always, enjoy today's math journey.